The report was late by 11 years. This was not, from the perspective of the Vel-Kaan Intelligence Directorate, an acceptable delay. The standard operational parameter for a deep cover asset was a 3-year deployment with annual encrypted status transmissions and a final comprehensive report upon extraction. Operative 7 Calven had been inserted into human civilian infrastructure on Relay Station Kappa 3 with a 3-year mandate, a cover identity as a Vel-Kaan commercial technician contracted to the station's Atmospheric Systems Division, and a specific analytical brief. Assess human behavioral patterns at the individual and community level in an isolated multi-species environment, identify consistent exploitation vectors, and report. 3 years became 4 when 7 Calven missed the first annual transmission. The Directorate had assessed this as equipment failure, a reasonable conclusion given the relay station's electromagnetic environment. 4 became 7 when he missed the second and third transmissions. The Directorate had assessed this as compromise and had activated extraction protocols and had sent 2 contact attempts that went unanswered. 7 became 11 when 7 Calven made contact with the Directorate voluntarily on a standard compact commercial communication channel in a message that was not encrypted and not coded and that said, in plain standard compact trade language, "I am alive and well and I will be returning shortly with my report. I apologize for the delay. I needed more time to complete the analysis accurately." The Directorate received this message and spent 6 days deciding what to do with it before the Deputy Director overruled the Security Division's recommendation to treat 7 Calven as a compromised asset and instead authorized a secure reception meeting. The Deputy Director's reasoning, recorded in the internal decision log, was, "Any operative who has been living among humans for 11 years and is voluntarily returning with a report is an operative whose report we need to read." 7 Calven arrived at the Directorate's secure debriefing facility on the Vel-Kaan's third settled moon on a Thursday, which was a human day name designation that he used automatically now because he had been using the human calendar system for 11 years, and the Vel-Kaan calendar felt slightly imprecise to him in a way it had not before. He was 47 years old by Vel-Kaan reckoning and looked, to the 2 reception officers who met him at the docking bay, like a being who had been somewhere for a long time and had not been uncomfortable there. Not the appearance of a compromised operative, no signs of duress, no behavioral irregularities in the initial assessment. The signs of a being who had settled into something. His briefcase contained a physical document, 237 pages, handwritten in Vel-Kaan, which was unusual for a Directorate report because the standard format was digital, and the handwritten format was a historical practice that had been superseded by secure digital transmission 60 years ago. The reception officer said, "Why physical?" 7 Calven said, "Because I wanted to make certain it was read rather than processed. A physical document requires a reader. A digital file can be summarized by an analytical system, and the summary can be read instead of the document. I did not want this document summarized." The reception officer looked at the briefcase. 7 Calven said, "Also, humans write things down by hand when they want the record to be real. I have been doing it for 11 years. It is a habit now." The debriefing was conducted by the Deputy Director herself, which was a significant departure from standard protocol and which communicated to 7 Calven that the Directorate was taking the return seriously. The Deputy Director was named Vel-Kaan, 61 years old, and had run the Intelligence Directorate for 8 years, and had in 8 years developed a reputation for the kind of analytical rigor that made her subordinates careful about what they said to her and how. She had read the report before the debriefing, all 237 pages. She sat across from 7 Calven in the debriefing room and said, "Start from the beginning." 7 Calven said, "The insertion was standard. The cover identity was established without difficulty. Atmospheric Systems Technician on Kappa 3, which is a mid-size relay station with approximately 4,000 residents from 11 species. The human population was approximately 900 at the time of insertion, which was the second largest single-species population on the station. Vel-Kaan said, the original analytical brief. Ven said, assess behavioral patterns, identify exploitation vectors, report. Vel-Kaan said, you were late. Ven said, I was late because the original brief produced a finding I. And the first year that made the second and third years necessary, and the second and third years produced findings that made the fourth through seventh years necessary. And by year 7, I understood that I would not be able to write an accurate report until I had completed the full analysis, and the full analysis required the full 11 years. Vel-Kaan said, what finding in the first year required the extension? Ven said, I found the first exploitation vector in the third month. I documented it. It was real, a consistent pattern of human behavior under resource scarcity that produced predictable responses. I prepared to transmit the first annual status update with the finding. He paused. And then, he said, I watched the exploitation vector disappear. Vel-Kaan said, explain. Ven said, the resource scarcity was a temporary station supply issue, a delayed resupply that lasted approximately 6 weeks. During the scarcity, humans exhibited the predicted stress behaviors. Competitive resource access, elevated interpersonal friction, decision-making under pressure, standard patterns. I documented them and assessed them as reliable. He paused again. At week 7, he said, the resupply arrived. The scarcity ended. The stress behaviors disappeared immediately. What I did not expect was what replaced them. He looked at his hands for a moment. What replaced them was a community response to the experience of the scarcity. The humans on the station organized a review of the station's supply redundancy systems. They held community meetings. They identified the gaps in the supply chain that had allowed the scarcity to develop. They implemented structural changes to prevent recurrence. They did this collectively without being directed to do it within 3 weeks of the resupply. Vel-Kaan said the exploitation vector was addressed. Ven said it was not merely addressed. It was analyzed, documented, systematically remediated, and the remediation was shared with the station's administrative body in a formal proposal that was adopted within the month. He paused. By month 11 of my deployment, the resource scarcity exploitation vector that I had documented in month 3 was no longer present. The humans had effectively eliminated it through collective action that none of them had been instructed to take. Vel-Kaan said, you found this significant. Ven said, I found it significant enough that I went back and examined every vulnerability I had identified and assessed whether the same pattern applied. He paused. It applied to all of them. The report's first section was titled On the Nature of Human Vulnerability, and it began with a sentence that Vel-Kaan had read 3 times before the debriefing. Human vulnerabilities are not stable features of the species. They are temporary states that are resolved at a rate and completeness that exceeds any exploitation timeline I can construct. Ven in the debriefing said, I spent the first 3 years documenting vulnerabilities, resource scarcity response, social fragmentation under external pressure, leadership dependency, the tendency for groups to become destabilized when familiar leadership structures were disrupted, communication failures under stress, decision paralysis in novel high-stakes situations. Vel-Kaan said, these are documented in the first section. Ven said, all real, all observed, all documented with specific incidents and behavioral data. He paused. And all resolved, every single one of them within a timeframe that ranged from weeks to months through processes that the humans undertook without external direction. Vel-Kaan said how. Ven said, they talked about it. That was the mechanism fundamentally. Every time the community experienced a stressor that exposed a vulnerability, the community talked about what had happened. Not universally, not in formal structured ways, sometimes it was informal conversations in the station's common areas. Sometimes it was community meetings. Sometimes it was a single person who had noticed the pattern writing it down and sharing the writing. But the talking happened, and the talking produced analysis, and the analysis produced responses, and the responses addressed the vulnerability. He paused. In 11 years on Kappa 3, I watched the human community on that station develop responses to 47 distinct vulnerabilities that I had documented. 47 vulnerabilities identified and resolved. The resolution was never perfect, new variations of old vulnerabilities would appear, or the remediation would have secondary effects that created new issues. But the directional trend was consistently toward reduction of exploitability. Vel-Kaan said, this is the finding that required the extension. The Ven said, this is the first finding, the second F. Ending required the years 4 through 7. The report's second section was titled on the mechanism of accumulation, and it was the longest section at 94 pages. Ven in the debriefing said, what I observed in years 4 through 7 was not the individual human or the individual community. It was what happened across time. The human community on Kappa 3 in year 4 was different from the community in year 1. Not because the individuals had changed dramatically, though people had come and gone, because the community had accumulated institutional knowledge. Vel-Kaan said, institutional knowledge about their vulnerabilities. Ven said, about everything. Every difficult situation the community had navigated, every supply disruption, every interpersonal conflict that had threatened community cohesion, every novel challenge that had required adaptive response. All of it was in the community's informal record. Not always written down, though often written down. Embedded in the practices they had adopted, the structures they had developed, the specific individuals who remembered why certain procedures existed and taught the reasoning to new arrivals. He paused. I began to understand, around year 5, that I was not observing a static population with vulnerabilities to be mapped. I was observing a community that was continuously updating its own capability profile. The community I would have reported on in year 3 was not the community I was observing in year 5. The year 3 community had 47 vulnerabilities. The year 5 community had addressed 31 of them and was in the process of addressing the remaining 16. Vel-Kaan said, and by year 11's. Ven said, by year 11, the community had addressed all 47 that I had originally documented and had developed responses to 11 additional vulnerabilities that had emerged during the 7 subsequent years. The year 11 community was, by any exploitability assessment, categorically more difficult to exploit than the year 1 community. Vel-Kaan said, in a single relay station community. Ven said, in a single relay station community of 900 humans. Now multiply this by every human community across every station and colony and settlement. Multiply it by the accumulation of institutional knowledge across generations. The Compact's records show that the human communities in the ascending corridor are currently in their second and third generations of settlement, which means the institutional knowledge is not starting from zero with each new community. It is being transmitted from prior communities, modified, extended, and transmitted again. He paused. The Directorate's assessment of human vulnerabilities is based on observation of human communities in the early stages of establishment, communities with limited institutional knowledge, communities that are starting from scratch. The assessment was not wrong at the time it was made. The communities being assessed in the early contact period had the vulnerabilities the assessment documented. He paused. The communities that exist now are not those communities. They are the communities that have had 60 years to accumulate the institutional knowledge that addresses those vulnerabilities. The third section of the report was titled on what I learned by living there, and it was the section that the deputy director had found most difficult to process, and the section that the security division had identified as the primary evidence of compromise. The security division's concern was that Vel-Kaan had developed what they termed sympathetic bias, the well-documented operational risk of deep cover assets, who spent extended periods in their target environment and developed personal attachments that distorted their analytical objectivity. Vel-Kaan in the debriefing said, "I know the security division's assessment." Vel-Kaan said, "The third section is the section they flagged." Vel-Kaan said, "Yes, I expected this. I want to address it directly." Vel-Kaan said, "Go ahead." Vel-Kaan said, "The sympathetic bias concern is valid as a general operational risk. It is not what happened in my case. I want to explain the distinction, and I want you to assess the distinction for yourself rather than accepting my assertion that it applies." He reached into the briefcase and produced a secondary document, 20 pages, which he placed on the table. He said, "This is a self-assessment of my analytical objectivity, completed in year 8 of the deployment when I became aware that the security division would raise the sympathetic bias question upon my return. The self-assessment documents, specifically, the ways in which my perspective changed during the deployment, and distinguishes between changes that represent bias and changes that represent information." Vel-Kaan picked up the documents. Vel-Kaan said, "The changes that represent bias would be developing personal attachments that caused me to suppress findings that reflected negatively on the subjects, developing an emotional investment in the subject's success, experiencing a shift in allegiance such that my primary loyalty was to the community I was embedded in rather than to the directorate." Vel-Kaan said, "And did those changes occur?" Vel-Kaan said, "The attachments occurred. I will not claim otherwise. Over 11 years, I developed genuine relationships with individuals in the station community. These are documented in the third section because they are relevant to the analysis. Some of the most significant findings came from those relationships. The attachments did not cause me to suppress negative findings. The report contains 47 documented vulnerabilities. It contains specific recommendations for exploitation approaches that would be effective in the first 3 years of contact with any new human community before institutional knowledge develops. It contains an honest assessment of human limitations. The attachments did not produce bias in the report." Vel-Kaan said, "What did they produce?" Vel-Kaan said, "Information that could not be obtained without them." He paused. "The changes that represent information rather than bias are these: I understand how humans think in a way that I did not understand before the deployment. Not their vulnerabilities, those can be assessed from distance. How they think. The internal architecture of their decision-making, their relationship with time and memory, the specific way they construct meaning from experience and then use that meaning to guide future decisions. These things cannot be assessed from distance. They require proximity and time and the specific quality of relationship that produces honest communication." He was quiet for a moment. "What I found," he said, "is that humans are extraordinarily transparent when they trust you. Not strategically transparent, I mean genuinely, functionally transparent. When a human trusts you, they will tell you what they are thinking, what they are afraid of, what they are uncertain about, what they have learned from past failures. The transparency is not naivety. It is the same mechanism that drives the institutional knowledge accumulation. The sharing of information is the practice they use to process and resolve difficulty, and when you are trusted, you are included in the sharing." Vel-Kaan said, "And you were trusted." Vel-Kaan said, "Over time, yes, not immediately. Humans are cautious about trust initially, particularly across species lines. but they have clear criteria for extending trust, and if you meet the criteria consistently over time, the trust follows. He paused. The criteria are simpler than our intelligence training would suggest. They are: do you show up when you say you will? Do you do what you commit to doing? Do you treat the people around you with consistent respect regardless of their status? And do you acknowledge when you are wrong? Vel-Kaan said, those are the criteria. Vel-Kaan said, those are the primary criteria. There is a secondary one that took me longer to understand. Do you care about the community's welfare rather than just your own? Humans are very good at detecting whether someone is present in the community for extractive purposes, taking what is useful and providing nothing of genuine value. An operative who maintains cover purely by meeting the primary criteria, but who does not genuinely contribute to the community, will eventually be experienced as hollow, and the trust will not extend or will be withdrawn. Vel-Kaan said, you contributed. Vel-Kaan said, I contributed, not as a cover strategy, because by year 3 maintaining a purely extractive presence was becoming incompatible with maintaining the cover. The community's trust extension process requires genuine contribution, and the cover required trust, so the contribution became real. He paused. This is the part the security division will flag as compromise. I am telling you, it is the part that produced the most analytically significant information. Vel-Kaan said, tell me what it produced. Vel-Kaan was quiet for a moment. He said, I am going to tell you about a woman named Priya Nair. Vel-Kaan said nothing. Vel-Kaan said, she was the station's chief environmental officer for 6 of the 11 years I was there. She was 53 years old when I arrived and 64 when I left. Human lifespan is approximately 80 to 90 years in current conditions, so she was in her middle years for the full period of my observation. She was the person I came to understand best over the 11 years, which is why she is the subject of the most extensive individual case study in the 3rd section. He paused. She was not a remarkable human by the standards that the Directorate uses to evaluate human capability. She was not a military officer. She was not a diplomat or a politician. She was an environmental officer on a mid-size relay station, managing the systems that kept 4,000 beings alive in a metal structure in space. Her specific skills were systems management, personnel coordination, resource allocation, and the specific kind of problem-solving that came from managing complex interdependent systems over long periods of time. Vel-Kaan said, not a high-value target. Vel-Kaan said, not a high-value target in the way the Directorate defines high value. What she was over 11 years was the most consistently instructive subject I observed, because she was ordinary. She was an ordinary human doing ordinary human work in an ordinary human way, and watching her do it for 11 years taught me more about what humans actually are than any number of observations of their diplomatic or military elite. Vel-Kaan said, what did you learn? Vel-Kaan said, she worked, not in the sense of employment, in the sense of sustained, engaged, purposeful effort directed at understanding the systems she managed and making them function better, every day, not dramatically, not with the specific intensity of crisis response, which is what the Directorate's behavioral assessments of humans tend to document. She worked in the ordinary, sustained way of someone who had decided that the work mattered and was going to do it well. He paused. What I observed over 11 years was that this ordinary sustained effort, replicated across the human community, produced something cumulative that was not visible in any individual's contribution, but was visible in the station's functioning over time. The station in year 11 was better maintained, better organized, better equipped to handle disruptions, and better connected to the information networks that made it resilient. All of this without any deliberate station-wide improvement program, simply through the accumulated effect of many ordinary people doing their work well over many years. Vel-Kaan said, the institutional knowledge mechanism again. Seven Calvin said, "Yes, but I want to be specific about what I mean by it, because the institutional knowledge framing can make it sound more deliberate than it actually is. It is not a deliberate program. It is not a strategic accumulation. It is the side effect of a large number of ordinary people caring about doing their work well and sharing what they learn with the people around them." Priya Nair documented every system's failure she encountered and why it happened and what she did about it. Not because she was building an institutional archive, because she found it useful to have the record when the next failure happened, and because she knew the people who came after her would find the record useful too. He paused. She did not think of this as building institutional knowledge. She thought of it as being responsible. He paused again. The distinction matters. A behavior that is strategic can be disrupted by disrupting the strategy. A behavior that is simply what responsible people do cannot be disrupted because it does not depend on any strategy. It depends on the quality of the people doing it. Vel-Kaan said the report's fourth section. The Seven Calvin said, the fourth section is the most difficult. Vel-Kaan said, I read it. The Seven Calvin said, then you know what it contains. Vel-Kaan said, I want to hear you say it. The Seven Calvin was quiet for a moment. He said, the fourth section is titled on what the directorate should do with this information. It is not a standard section for an intelligence report. I included it because I believed the findings required it. Vel-Kaan said, go ahead. Seven Calvin said, the directorate deployed me to identify exploitation vectors. The deployment produced 11 years of data that indicates consistently and without exception that exploitation-based strategy applied to human civilization is not viable over any timeline that matters. The vulnerabilities exist, are real, and are exploitable in the short term, specifically in the first 3 years of contact with a new community before institutional knowledge develops. Beyond that window, the vulnerabilities close faster than they can be acted on. He paused. The directorate has been developing exploitation strategy for human civilization for 30 years. The 30 years of strategy development is based on assessments of human vulnerability that were accurate at the time they were made and are now outdated. The human communities being assessed now are not the communities that were assessed 30 years ago. The communities that will exist in 30 more years will not be the communities being assessed now. Vel-Kaan said, the trajectory problem. The Seven Call. Ven said, the trajectory problem. Every year that passes, the institutional knowledge accumulates further. Every year, the exploitation window in new communities is shorter because the knowledge of how to address vulnerabilities is transmitted more quickly from established communities to new ones. In 30 years, the exploitation window may not exist at all. The institutional knowledge may be sufficiently advanced that new communities begin with a level of resilience that current established communities have taken decades to develop. He paused. The directorate's exploitation strategy, if it were deployed today, would be more effective than if deployed in 30 years. It would be less effective than if deployed 30 years ago. The optimal deployment window for exploitation strategy against human civilization has already passed. Vel-Kaan said, this is the assessment the security division flagged as the product of sympathetic bias. Seven Calvin said, yes, I want to address that directly. The security division's position is that an unbiased assessment would not reach this conclusion because the conclusion is convenient for the humans and inconvenient for the directorate. Vel-Kaan said, is that not a valid concern? Seven Calvin said, it would be valid if the conclusion were not supported by the data. The data is in the report. 237 pages of observations from 11 years with specific incidents, timelines, behavioral documentation, and analysis. The security division's argument is not that the data is wrong. It is that my interpretation of the data is biased. I am asking the directorate to read the data and reach its own interpretation. He paused. But I want to add something to the analytical finding that is in the fourth section, and that I believe is the most important thing in the report, and that I cannot make into data because it is not a data question. Vel-Kaan said, say it. Seven said, the exploitation strategy is not viable. I have established this analytically. But the question of whether to pursue it is not only an analytical question, it is a strategic one. And the strategic question is not only, can we succeed? The strategic question is, if we attempt this and they respond, what is the relationship we have after? Vel-Kaan was quiet. Seven said, I spent 11 years on Kappa 3. I know the human community on that station. I know Priya Nair. I know the specific quality of what those humans are at the individual and community level. And I know what they are at the civilizational level from 11 years of paying attention to everything that came through the relay station, the communications, the diplomatic transmissions, the commercial traffic, the news. He paused. I know that the compact's relationship with humanity is producing something. The Vel-Kaan communication, the Narration working document, the ascending corridors development, the things that exist now that did not exist 60 years ago because humanity went somewhere and stayed and built something. Vel-Kaan said, this is the sympathetic bias. Seven said, this is the information I have that you do not have. You have assessments of human vulnerability. You have strategic analysis of the Vel-Kaan's competitive position relative to humanity. You have everything the directorate has compiled in 30 years of external observation. He paused. You do not have 11 years of being inside the community, earning the trust, being included in the sharing of information that happens when humans trust you. You do not know what they actually are from the inside. Well, he paused again. I do, and what I know is, the exploitation strategy would cost you the relationship. And the relationship is worth more than anything the exploitation strategy could produce. Vel-Kaan said, worth more to whom? Seven said, worth more to the Vel-Kaan collective. Vel-Kaan looked at him. Seven said, I am a Vel-Kaan intelligence operative. My loyalty is to the collective. My assessment is that the Vel-Kaan collective's strategic interest is best served by a relationship with human civilization rather than an exploitation strategy against it, for two reasons. The first reason is analytical. The exploitation strategy will not succeed over a meaningful timeline. The second reason is strategic. The things that human civilization is building in the ascending corridor, the institutional knowledge, the multi-species relationships, the governance frameworks, the Vel-Kaan communication, the Narration working document. These are things that the Vel-Kaan collective will benefit from if we are part of the community that builds them, and will be excluded from if we are identified as adversarial. He paused. The compact security architecture is being revised. The ascending corridors governance frameworks are being built. These frameworks will determine what the galaxy looks like for the next several centuries. The species that help build them will have influence in how they are built. The species that are identified as adversarial will not. Vel-Kaan said, you are recommending against the exploitation strategy. Seven said, I am recommending that the directorate present the council with an accurate picture of the strategic situation, including the finding that the exploitation strategy's optimal window has passed, and the finding that the relationship has strategic value that exceeds the exploitation strategy's projected return. He paused. I am also recommending that the directorate's 30 years of knowledge about human civilization, which is the most complete external knowledge base that any non-compact species has, be reframed from exploitation intelligence to relationship intelligence. We know them better than they know we know them. That is an asset. It does not have to be a weapon. The debriefing lasted 2 days. The report was reviewed by 3 separate analytical teams over 4 weeks. The Security Division's compromise assessment was formally disputed in the review process by two of the three teams, both of which concluded that the analytical conclusions were supported by the documented data and that the sympathetic bias concern was not substantiated by the data's quality or completeness. The third team's assessment was more cautious. They agreed that the exploitation strategy was no longer viable, but did not endorse the recommendation for a relationship reorientation, on the grounds that it was outside the analytical brief and represented a policy position rather than an intelligence finding. The deputy director's response to the three assessments was a memo that she circulated to the council without the analytical team's review, attached to the full 237-page report. The memo said, "The council should read this report, not a summary of this report, the report itself. I will not attempt to synthesize 237 pages of 11-year operational intelligence into a briefing document, because doing so would be precisely the failure of attention that the operative's choice of physical format was designed to prevent. The report is late by 11 years. It is also the most complete picture of human civilization that any intelligence service in this region of space has produced. It was produced by an operative who lived inside the community he was assessing for 11 years and who returned voluntarily because he believed the information was important enough to bring back. The Security Division's compromise assessment is noted. The operative's analytical conclusions are supported by the data. The recommendation in Section 4 is outside the operational brief. It is also, in my assessment, correct. The council should decide what to do with this. I am placing it in front of you because that is my function. What happens next is yours." The council read the report. The reading took 3 weeks because the council had 17 members and all 17 read it personally, per the deputy director's instruction, which was unusual enough that 2 of the 17 commented on it in their formal response, both of them noting that the instruction was the correct one and that they were glad they had followed it. The council's deliberation took 4 months. During those 4 months, Vel-Kaan was at the directorate facility on the third moon, available for follow-up consultation, spending his days in a way that the facility staff found unusual. He wrote about the 11 years in the format that humans used, not reports, not analytical documents, but the specific form of detailed personal record that humans called journals, filling notebooks with the accumulated memory of what he had observed and experienced and learned. When a facility administrator asked him why he was writing it down, he said, "Because humans write things down when they want the record to be real, and this was real. I want it to be real." The administrator looked at the notebooks and said, "Will you submit them to the directorate's archive?" The Vel-Kaan said, "Yes, and I want copies sent to Kappa 3. The administrator said, "To the station." Vel-Kaan said, "To specific people on the station. The journal entries relevant to each person should go to that person. They deserve to know they were seen." He paused. "That is a human thing, I know. They believe that being seen matters. I spent 11 years learning whether they are right about this." The administrator said, "Are they?" Vel-Kaan said, "Yes." The council's decision was delivered to the deputy director on a Monday morning, which was a day-name designation that the deputy director had started using after reading the report, because it had made human time structuring feel specific in a way it had not before. The decision said in the FO RML language of Vel-Kaan Council resolutions. The Council has reviewed the report submitted by Operative Vel-Kaan and the analytical assessments produced by the Directorate's review teams. The Council has reached the following determinations. 1. The exploitation strategy's viability window against established human communities has passed. The Directorate is directed to update its strategic assessments accordingly. 2. The knowledge base developed over 30 years of human observation is to be reclassified from exploitation intelligence to relationship intelligence. The Directorate's analytical division is directed to reframe the 30 years of data in terms of what it reveals about human decision-making, values, and institutional development, for use in relationship development rather than exploitation planning. 3. The Council authorizes the Deputy Director to approach the Compact's diplomatic frameworks with an application for Vel-Kaan observer status in the Ascending Corridors Governance Working Groups. This is a preliminary step. The Directorate is directed to assess the reception of this approach and report within 6 months. 4. Operative 7 Colven is to be formally acknowledged for the report and the service it represents. The lateness of the report is noted. The Council's assessment is that the lateness was operationally necessary and that the 11-year investment produced returns that a 3-year deployment could not have produced. This assessment is to be incorporated into the Directorate's future operational planning for deep cover deployments. 5. The Operative's recommendation regarding the transmission of journal entries to specific individuals on Kappa 3 is approved. The Council notes that this is unusual and that the Operative has provided a sufficient reason for the unusual action. 7 Colven read the decision in the Deputy Director's office. When he finished reading, he was quiet for a moment. He said the observer status application. Vel-Kaan said, "It will take time. The Compact's working groups are not simple to enter." 7 Colven said, "The human delegation's ambassador is named Noah Maro-Vazic. She has been in Compact governance for 30 years. She knows the working groups from the inside." Vel-Kaan said, "You know her record." 7 Colven said, "I read everything that came through the relay station. She appeared in the diplomatic traffic regularly. She is the kind of person who reads the archive." He paused. "If the application is honest about what the Vel-Kaan want from the working groups and why she will take it seriously, if it is performed diplomacy, she will recognize it immediately." Vel-Kaan said, "Then it will be honest." 7 Colven said, "Good." He looked at the decision document for a moment. He said the journal entries to Kappa 3. Vel-Kaan said, "Will be sent." He said Priya Nair retired last year. She is on Colony Ascending 2 now. Her entry will need to go there. Vel-Kaan said it will reach her. 7 Colven said, "She does not know I was an operative." Vel-Kaan said, "The journal entries do not need to identify you as an operative." 7 Colven said, "No, but she should know she was observed carefully. She should know that the work she did for 11 years was seen and documented and that someone who watched her do it considered it the most instructive 11 years of his life." He paused. "She kept records because she believed the record was important. Her record is important. She deserves to know it." Vel-Kaan said, "You can write that in the entry." 7 Colven said, "I already did." He picked up his briefcase. It was lighter now without the report, which was in the Directorate's archive where it belonged. He said, "I would like to return to Kappa 3. Vel-Kaan said, "Your cover identity is no longer operational." 7 Colven said, "I know, I am not asking to return as an operative. I am asking to return as myself, a Vel-Kaan who spent 11 years on the station and would like to maintain the relationships he built there." He paused. "This is allowed private travel. The Vel-Kaan have commercial relationships in the Ascending Corridor. A returning long-term resident is not unusual." Vel-Kaan looked at him for a long moment. She said, "The security division will have concerns." 7 Colven said, "Yes." She said, "Do you have a response to the concerns?" 7 Colven said, "My response is that I spent 11 years learning something that the Directorate needed to know and I came back with it, and the Council found it worth acting on. The security division's concerns about my continued contact with the station community are valid as operational risks. They are not valid as reasons to prohibit a private individual from maintaining relationships with people he knows. Vel-Kaan said, "You are planning to go regardless of what I say." Positive. Enkal then said, "I would prefer your approval." Vel-Kaan said, "You have it." She paused. The council's decision says the operative's recommendation about the journal entries was approved because he had provided a sufficient reason. I want to ask what the reason was. Seven Colven said, "I wrote it in the application. The reason was they were seen, being seen matters. It is not a Vel-Kaan concept, but it is a true one, and I have been in the practice of recording true things for 11 years. He left the deputy director's office. He walked through the directorate facility toward the transit bay, carrying the lighter briefcase and the notebooks and the 11 years that he had carried back through the relay chain from a mid-sized station in the outer ascending corridor. He thought about Priya Nair in her retirement on the second ascending colony, where the sky was a different color and the gravity was slightly different, and the station she had spent her working life maintaining was a communication signal away. He thought about the records she had kept, the system's failures documented and analyzed and remediated, the institutional knowledge accumulated across decades of careful work and carefully shared, the specific ordinary quality of a person who had decided the work mattered and had done it well for her entire career. He thought about what the report had said about her, in the section on the mechanism of accumulation, and about the conclusion he had reached, that the ordinary sustained effort of ordinary responsible people, accumulated across a community and across time, was the single most significant thing he had observed in 11 years of intelligence work. He thought the directorate sent me to find exploitation vectors. I found 47. I also found what closes them. The closing is the point. He thought the report is in the archive. The council has acted on it. The Vel-Kaan's 30 years of data is being reframed. The observer status application will be submitted. All of this will develop the way things develop, slowly, with setbacks, with the specific friction of large institutions changing direction. He thought Priya Nair will receive her journal entry. She will read that someone watched her do her work for 11 years and found it the most instructive observation of his career. She will probably not fully understand what this means. She will probably think it is a generous thing to say about a mid-level environmental officer's ordinary professional record. He thought she will not know that her ordinary professional record is, in a document in the Vel-Kaan Intelligence Directorate's archive, the evidence that changes in intelligence services 30-year strategy. He thought that is exactly what the report found. The most significant things are often invisible in the moment. The 12 minutes at the fuel depot, the 900 calories of food planning, the 43 non-escalating confrontations, the records kept by someone who believed the records were important. He thought the report is late by 11 years, and it was right on time. He boarded the transit. He went back.